Welcome to the Turning Point Stories, where every episode unfolds a real or imagined moment that changed a life forever. Have you ever felt invisible, even when everyone seems to be watching? What happens when the world you built online suddenly disappears? Kiara woke up to the familiar sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Her eyes, still heavy with sleep, immediately searched for the tiny screen that had become the first and last thing she looked at every day. Notifications, comments, shares. They were her lifeline, her pulse, her reason to wake up each morning. Without them, she often felt invisible. And today, like every day, she was anxious. Would today finally be the day someone noticed her? Someone really noticed her. For years, Kiara had poured her life into social media. Her content wasn't just a hobby, it was her identity. She crafted every post, every video, every image with painstaking care, hoping for validation, seeking approval, needing attention. Every time her phone chimed, her heart jumped. Every like gave her a sense of accomplishment. Every comment a connection. But silence made her stomach twist and her chest tighten. She had built her self-worth around the approval of strangers, allowing tiny numbers on a screen to dictate how she felt about herself. This morning was no different. Kiara scrolled endlessly, her eyes flicking from notification to notification. There were a few likes, some from friends, some from people she barely knew, but nothing spectacular. Nothing that made her feel truly alive. She sighed, tossing the phone onto her bed, and stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the hours she had spent creating content that seemed to disappear into the digital void. Every hour editing, every caption she agonized over, every filter meticulously chosen, all of it dependent on recognition she could never fully control. Kiara's obsession wasn't just casual. It had started innocently enough, a post here, a comment there, but over time it had grown into something all-consuming. Her waking hours were spent planning content. Her sleeping hours were haunted by thoughts of engagement rates. She had convinced herself that the numbers were proof of her existence, proof that she mattered. And in a way, they had become the only proof she trusted. When she looked in the mirror, she saw herself through the lens of her social media presence. Perfect, curated, acceptable. But the reflection behind her carefully crafted posts, the real Kiara, had been buried under the weight of her online persona. Her friends had tried to intervene. They called her to hang out, invited her to events, sent messages asking if she wanted to meet up. But Kiara had been too busy. She told herself they wouldn't understand, that they couldn't see the importance of her digital life. After all, these numbers, these metrics were real. They were her validation. They were proof that she mattered. And so, she isolated herself, spending hours in front of her phone, scrolling, refreshing, hoping, craving. It wasn't just about the followers or the likes anymore. It was about the feeling they gave her. That brief, fleeting sense of being noticed. That tiny spark of importance that vanished as quickly as it arrived. And the more she chased it, the more she felt empty. But she couldn't stop. She didn't want to stop. She was addicted not just to her phone but to the way it made her feel, the way it controlled her mood, the way it dictated her sense of self. She had become a prisoner of her own creation. A slave to validation that didn't belong to her. That morning, she decided to film a new video. She sat on her bed, phone in hand, rehearsing lines over and over, imagining the perfect angle, the perfect expression. She wanted this post to be different. She wanted it to go viral. She wanted it to prove to herself and to the world that she was worthy, that she was enough. She smiled at herself in the camera, forcing energy into her expression, pretending she was excited, even as her chest felt heavy with doubt. She pressed record, hoping, praying that this time everything would work out. Hours passed. She edited meticulously, adding music, captions, filters, making sure everything was flawless. And when she finally hit the upload button, she leaned back, expecting that familiar rush of notifications. She waited, refreshing her screen every few seconds. But something felt different this time. The likes trickled in, but slowly. Fewer than she expected. Fewer than she deserved. And that creeping sensation she had tried to ignore, the one she felt every time recognition fell short, began to gnaw at her. Her stomach tightened, her hands trembled slightly. In that moment, she realized just how dependent she had become on the approval of others. Every post, every video, every effort she had poured into her digital identity had been validated only by strangers she would never meet. She wanted their acknowledgement like air, like water. And the fear of losing it terrified her. It had become her obsession, her addiction, and now it was quietly suffocating her. That afternoon, she decided to take a break from posting and spend some time editing older videos. As she leaned over her desk, adjusting angles and color grades, she didn't notice the phone perched precariously at the edge. And then it happened. In a single small motion, the phone slipped from her grasp, tumbling to the floor. The sound of it hitting the ground was jarring, a sharp crack that echoed in the empty room. Kiera froze, staring at the screen that was now a fractured mosaic of glass. The display was dark. And in that instant, her heart seemed to stop. Her breath caught. The familiar lifeline she had clung to for years, the tiny device that had measured her worth and defined her days, was gone. She tried pressing buttons, shaking it gently, plugging it in, but nothing worked. The screen remained black. The phone, her constant companion, her silent judge, her relentless mirror, was broken. For a moment, Kiera felt a strange mix of disbelief and panic. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't comprehend the sudden absence of the world she had known. Her hands trembled as she reached for it again and again, hoping for some miracle that would bring it back to life. But there was none. And then the reality hit her. Her entire digital life, the validation, the connections, the proof of her existence, had vanished in an instant. For the first time in years, she felt utterly invisible. She felt the weight of solitude, the sharp edge of dependency, and the hollowness that came with realizing how much she had relied on something so fragile. She had built her identity on a fragile screen, and now that it was gone, she didn't know who she was anymore. Days passed. Kiera didn't reach out to her friends, didn't post, didn't even open her laptop. She sat in silence, staring at the walls of her room, feeling the absence of the digital noise that had filled her life. The silence was deafening at first, unbearable even. She longed for the pings, the notifications, the little affirmations that had made her feel alive. But as the hours turned into days, something began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tightness in her chest began to loosen. The panic began to fade. And in that quiet, empty space, Kiera began to notice things she hadn't before. The warmth of sunlight on her skin, the sound of birds outside her window, the gentle rhythm of her own breathing. She remembered what it felt like to exist without a constant stream of validation. She remembered what it was like to be herself, without filters, without likes, without approval. It was unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but it was real. She realized that for years she had been living for everyone else, measuring her worth in the eyes of strangers, and ignoring the person she had been hiding underneath it all. The real Kiera, the one who laughed without thinking about how it looked on camera, the one who felt deeply without worrying about judgment, the one who existed independently of digital applause, was still there. And now, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. Kiera sat in her room, the quiet stretching around her like an endless, unfamiliar ocean. For the first time in years, she was alone with herself, not distracted by the constant hum of notifications or the comforting glow of her screen. The silence was oppressive at first. Her mind, used to constant stimulation, raced with memories of posts, likes, and comments. She could almost feel the absence of her phone pressing against her chest, a phantom weight she couldn't ignore. Panic gripped her in waves, each stronger than the last, until she felt physically weak. She remembered all the time she had crafted content late into the night, agonized over captions, polished every frame, and waited with bated breath for validation. She remembered the fleeting highs of notifications and the deep, gnawing lows when attention didn't arrive. And now, without her phone, without that constant source of approval, she felt stripped bare, exposed in a way she had never been before. The first few nights were the hardest. Kiera found herself pacing her room, talking to the air as if the device could somehow respond. She replayed every moment she had spent online, every post, every interaction, every effort she had made to be seen. She realized how much she had tied her self-worth to these meaningless numbers, how she had allowed strangers to determine her value. And the realization was crushing. She cried quietly, buried under blankets, alone in the darkness, mourning a life that had been so focused on digital affirmation that she had lost sight of herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years chasing validation, and now, when it was suddenly gone, she felt as though she didn't exist at all. But amid the fear and despair, a small flicker of curiosity began to emerge. Without the constant distraction of her phone, Kiara began to notice the world around her. She heard the soft rustling of leaves outside her window, the distant laughter of children playing in the street, the gentle hum of life moving forward even without her participation. At first, she barely acknowledged these details. She was too consumed by the sense of loss to appreciate them fully. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to seep into her consciousness. She started to sit by the window for longer periods, simply observing. She noticed the way sunlight played on the walls, the delicate patterns of shadows shifting with the day. She realized she hadn't truly seen these things in years because she had been too busy staring at a screen. She began to recognize that the world existed beyond her posts, beyond her followers, beyond the numbers that had dictated her moods. The world was still alive, vibrant, and indifferent to her absence. But in its indifference, she began to feel a strange sense of freedom. Kiara found herself reaching for a journal she hadn't touched in months. She hesitated at first, unsure if she could express anything that felt real. But she started writing. At first, it was disjointed. Random thoughts, anxieties, complaints, but gradually the words became more honest. She wrote about her fears, her insecurities, her regrets. She wrote about the emptiness she had felt while chasing approval, and the loneliness that had accompanied her every post. She wrote about her longing for something genuine, something that didn't depend on likes or comments. Through writing, Kiara began to confront herself. She acknowledged how much she had neglected her own happiness in pursuit of validation. She recognized the patterns she had fallen into, the compulsive checking, the constant comparison, the endless striving for attention. And she realized slowly and painfully that the very thing she had believed defined her, her online presence, had become a prison. As days turned into a week, Kiara experimented with small routines. She forced herself to wake up without reaching for her phone. She took walks, sometimes just around her neighborhood, sometimes venturing further, allowing herself to notice details she had long ignored. The taste of coffee, the feel of the wind on her face, the rhythm of her own footsteps. These were sensations she hadn't paid attention to in years. She began to feel her body again, her mind again, her presence again. Her isolation, once unbearable, started to shift into something quieter, something reflective. She began to enjoy her own company, to discover that she could exist without constant validation, without the digital applause that had once been her lifeline. She cooked meals for herself, prepared them thoughtfully, and ate without distraction. She rediscovered the simple pleasure of music, listening to songs without thinking about whether anyone else would hear them. She even tried sketching again, something she had loved as a child but abandoned because it wasn't shareable. Slowly, Kiara began to understand the concept of presence. She realized that life wasn't about being seen by everyone. It was about being fully present for herself. She could laugh without an audience, cry without a camera, live without a post to immortalize the moment. And the freedom of that realization was intoxicating. Yet, despite these small victories, doubts still crept in. There were moments when she longed for her old life, moments when she wondered if she had ruined her chance to connect, to be recognized, to be seen. The fear of invisibility still lingered, a shadow she couldn't entirely shake. But gradually, she learned to sit with it, to acknowledge it without letting it define her. She began to see that being unseen by strangers didn't equate to being unworthy. Her value was intrinsic, not external. Kiara also began to reconnect with people in ways she had neglected for years. She called friends she hadn't spoken to in months, not to boast about a post or share her content, but simply to talk, to listen, to engage in genuine conversation. She discovered the richness of human connection without the intermediary of a screen, without the filter of curation or performance. These interactions, though less frequent than her digital engagement, were far more fulfilling. And then, slowly, Kiera began to dream again, not about viral posts or follower counts, but about herself. She imagined a life where she pursued passions for her own satisfaction, where her creativity was an expression of joy, not a plea for recognition. She visualized mornings spent in quiet reflection, afternoons devoted to learning and growth, evenings filled with authentic connection. The possibilities felt vast, almost overwhelming, but also deeply liberating. One night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized she had spent so long seeking validation outside herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to trust herself. She had allowed her worth to be determined by strangers, by algorithms, by fleeting attention spans. And now, for the first time, she could reclaim it. Slowly, steadily, she could rebuild her sense of self from the inside out, not dependent on anyone else's recognition. Kiera's phone remained broken, and she didn't rush to replace it. Each day without it felt like a victory, a small assertion of independence, a step toward rediscovering herself. She began to appreciate the quiet moments, the unspectacular, the ordinary, as though she were seeing the world for the first time. And in that appreciation, she found a kind of peace she had never known. Her thoughts became clearer, her emotions more grounded. The compulsive anxiety that had plagued her for years began to lose its grip. She started to understand that life wasn't about how much attention she could attract, but how deeply she could feel, how genuinely she could live. The irony of losing her phone, the very thing that had enslaved her, became apparent. What she had feared as a loss was actually the beginning of freedom. By the end of part 2, Kiera had started to reclaim her identity. She was still fragile, still learning to navigate life without the constant digital validation, but she had discovered something more profound than any like or comment could ever provide: herself. The journey was just beginning, but the first step, acceptance, reflection, and small, deliberate action had been taken. And in that first step, she found the seeds of transformation, the promise of a turning point. Days continued to pass, each one subtly changing Kiera in ways she hadn't expected. She woke up without reaching for her phone first, instead stretching and taking a moment to feel the rhythm of her own breathing. She discovered a quiet satisfaction in small, intentional acts, making tea carefully, listening to the steam hiss, feeling the warmth of the cup against her hands. Simple pleasures, which she had long overlooked in the rush to produce content and collect validation, began to feel significant. For the first time in years, Kiera allowed herself to enjoy solitude without guilt. She read books she had abandoned, losing herself in stories without worrying whether anyone would notice her engagement. She painted and sketched again, not for followers, not for attention, but purely for the joy of creation. With each stroke of the brush, each word written in her journal, she felt her identity being rebuilt, not as a performer for the world, but as herself, whole and complete. The shift within Kiera wasn't sudden. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first. There were mornings when anxiety still gripped her, when she longed for the notifications that had once been her heartbeat. But now, she met these moments with curiosity rather than panic. She observed her feelings, acknowledged them, and let them pass. She realized that true strength wasn't in controlling external validation. It was in understanding and trusting herself. One afternoon, Kiera ventured out for a walk in the nearby park. The world around her felt different now. The chatter of people, the laughter of children, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. All of it seemed richer, fuller, more vibrant. She noticed details she had ignored before. The pattern of sunlight filtering through branches, the smell of wet earth after a brief rain, the rhythm of a dog's joyful bark as it chased a stick. Life existed beyond the screen, and it was beautiful in ways she had never truly appreciated. As she walked, Kiera reflected on the years she had spent tethered to her phone. She realized how much of her time had been consumed by comparison, by striving for attention, by seeking approval from strangers. She felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The sadness for the lost years, the relief for having finally broken free. She understood in a deep, visceral way that her phone had not just broken her ego, it had broken the illusion she had been living under. And that broken illusion had given her the space to heal. Kiara also began reconnecting with people in her real life. She called her closest friends, met them for coffee, and shared conversations that were not mediated by screens or likes. These moments of genuine connection were initially awkward. She had forgotten how to exist without the safety of her curated persona, but gradually they became natural. Laughter flowed more freely, stories were shared more honestly, and the bonds she had neglected for years strengthened. She realized that real relationships, built on understanding and empathy, offered far more fulfillment than the transient attention she had chased online. As weeks turned into a month, Kiara's confidence grew. Not the fragile, externally dependent confidence of her social media persona, but a quiet, steady confidence rooted in self-awareness. She discovered hobbies and passions she had ignored, talents she had overlooked. She experimented with cooking, tried yoga, and even joined a local art class. Each new experience reinforced the truth she had begun to internalize. Her worth was inherent, not measured by the approval of others. In the evenings, she sometimes thought about her phone. She could replace it by a new one, reconnect with the digital world. But she didn't feel the urgency she once had. She realized that her happiness, her peace, was not dependent on constant online engagement. She had learned to exist fully in the moment, to appreciate the tangible, to value her own experiences without needing to broadcast them. The fear that had once consumed her, the fear of being unseen, had lost its grip. Kiara also reflected on her creative work. She had once believed that her content was only valuable if it attracted attention. Now, she understood that the process of creation itself was rewarding. She began producing content again, but differently. Slower, more thoughtful, less concerned with metrics, more concerned with authenticity. She shared videos and posts occasionally, not seeking validation, but expressing herself. She realized that the true satisfaction came from the act of creation, not from the applause it might generate. The transformation was not without its challenges. Occasionally, old habits resurfaced, temptations to check notifications or measure worth by numbers crept in. But Kiara met these moments with self-compassion, recognizing them as reminders of her past patterns rather than failures. She learned to pause, reflect, and redirect her attention to what truly mattered. Her own growth, her own joy, her own presence. One morning, Kiara looked at herself in the mirror and truly saw herself for the first time in years. The reflection staring back at her was no longer filtered through the lens of social approval. It was real, imperfect, human, and she felt a profound sense of peace. She smiled softly, acknowledging herself, her journey, her resilience. The person she had been hiding beneath curated posts and anxious scrolling had returned, and she liked what she saw. As the days passed, Kiara's perspective shifted further. She began noticing the moments of beauty and connection that she had missed in the past, the kindness of strangers, the laughter of friends, the quiet satisfaction of personal accomplishments. She understood that life was full of turning points, moments where everything shifted if only one had the courage to embrace change. Her phone had broken, yes, but so had her ego. And in that brokenness, she had found clarity, freedom, and purpose. Kiara's story became one not of loss, but of discovery. She learned that happiness was not measured in likes or shares, but in presence and connection. She understood that peace was not found in attention, but in acceptance. And she realized that true fulfillment came not from being seen, but from truly seeing herself and the world around her. One evening, sitting by her window and watching the sun dip below the horizon, Kiara reflected on everything she had learned. She understood that life would always present challenges, that old habits and fears might return, but she now had the tools to navigate them. She had reclaimed herself piece by piece, and in doing so, had discovered the priceless truth. Her worth had never depended on anyone else. It had been within her all along. Kiara's journey was a turning point, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever tied their value to external approval. She had faced fear, panic, and isolation, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate toward herself. She had learned that loss could lead to growth, that brokenness could lead to freedom, and that silence could lead to clarity. And she knew, with a quiet certainty, that she would never again allow the measure of her life to be defined by numbers on a screen. Her story was now one of self-discovery, of reclaiming agency over her own happiness, and of finding joy in the ordinary, the authentic, and the present. Kiara smiled to herself, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the journey she had endured. The phone that had once dominated her life had shattered, yes, but in its place, something far more enduring had emerged. Peace, purpose, and the realization that she had been enough all along. In that moment, Kiara understood what it truly meant to experience a turning point. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a quiet, internal shift, a decision to value herself beyond external validation, a choice to live authentically and fully. And she knew that this turning point would shape every choice, every moment, every day from now on. Kiara's story had begun with a broken phone, but it ended with something unbreakable. Her own self-worth, her own inner peace, and her own understanding that life's most profound changes often come when we lose the illusions we have relied upon for far too long. She had faced the void, stared into the silence, and discovered the immeasurable value of simply being herself. And in that discovery, Kiara found her turning point. The day her phone broke, her ego shattered, and her life, quietly and beautifully, began again. If you're scrolling right now, feeling small, lost, or invisible, remember this. Your worth isn't in the numbers, the likes, or the followers. Your turning point is waiting inside you. Subscribe to The Turning Point for more stories that touch your heart and awaken your spirit.